Slow breathing, could it make you feel worse? And it can. I was giving a talk, News Talk Radio, it's going back about 6 months or so, but one of the listeners called in and she says that when she does slow breathing, she gets lightheaded. Now, slow breathing on the face of it should be beneficial, but why is she getting lightheaded? When we think about breathing, I suppose the best way to think about breathing is think in terms of another function, eating. So you're going to have either your breakfast, your lunch, your dinner today. And somebody will give you, or you've prepared yourself, a plate of food. In order to eat the food off that plate, now the volume of the food that's on the plate is the volume of food that you're going to be taking into your body. You don't want to be overeating. In other words, eating more food than what your body needs, because of course, then we put on weight, or you don't want to be under-eating. And that's eating less food than what your metabolic needs are. But in order to calculate the food that's eaten off the plate, we're handed a fork or a spoon or some utensil. It could be a big fork, could be a small fork. So it's the number of forkfuls multiplied by the size of the fork that determines the volume of food on the plate. Okay, that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? So think about that the next time you sit down for your meal. You have a fork, you have the size of a fork, and it's the number of forkfuls by the size of the fork that will determine the volume of food that you eat. And the volume of food is the big one. So whatever food that we eat off that plate is the key. It's not the size of the fork, that doesn't matter. The number of forkfuls doesn't matter. It's the volume of food. When we think about breathing, we should be thinking about the volume of air that we are breathing. And the volume of air that we are breathing is calculated by the respiratory rate, which is the number of breaths that we breathe, typically over 1 minute, multiplied by the size of each breath. So in other words, when we take a breath of air into the lungs, what volume of air are we taking in? So it's the respiratory rate multiplied by the tidal volume gives us minute volume. So making that same comparison with food, the respiratory rate is the number of forkfuls. The tidal volume is the size of the fork. The minute volume of air is the volume of food that you're eating off the plate. Our objective is not to underbreathe or overbreathe, but just breathe right. So homeostasis, normal breathing. So when a person phones in and she says, well, I've tried slow breathing, but it makes me lightheaded. And I think this is going to be really, really common. And the reason being is because the focus is on slowing down the respiratory rate. And very often the people who need breathing practices the most are people who are stressed and people with dysfunctional breathing. And this is the group that will have a tendency to breathe faster. They won't have a normal respiratory rate. They feel that they're not getting enough air. They may have some fear as well, response towards their breathing, and because of the increased stress, they're breathing faster. So they may be breathing 20 breaths per minute. Okay, so the respiratory rate is too high. And yes, it does make sense to encourage that person to breathe slower, but it doesn't take into consideration that they are already feeling uncomfortable with their breathing. And if I say to a person who is breathing 20 breaths per minute, I would like you to breathe in for 4 seconds and out for 6 seconds, and that person slows down the respiratory rate to 6 breaths per minute. The gap is too much. And that person is going to feel very uncomfortable going from 20 breaths per minute in their normal breathing to a practice of 6 breaths. To compensate for the feeling of discomfort, they're going to increase their tidal volume so much. And this can have a paradoxical impact on their minute volume, and they end up overbreathing. And when they end up overbreathing, they blow off too much carbon dioxide, because that's what overbreathing does. You get rid of too much carbon dioxide from the lungs, that you're breathing carbon dioxide, too much of it, into the atmosphere. When you lower carbon dioxide in your lungs, you reduce carbon dioxide in the blood leaving the lungs, and when this happens, you reduce blood flow to the brain. That's why she felt dizzy. But not only do you reduce blood flow to the brain, when you blow off too much carbon dioxide by breathing slow and by disproportionately having increased breaths or increased volume per breath, that you increase the volume of air that you are breathing. And I hope that kind of makes sense. You know, it's coming back to the food analogy. You have your plate of food, that's really what matters. So with us in breathing, it's the volume of air that you breathe in that minute that's what matters. How much air What's the total volume of air that you breathe across that minute? But that's calculated by the respiratory rate. The respiratory rate multiplied with the tidal volume to give you the minute volume. So if you're lowering your respiratory rate, how much is the tidal volume increasing by? And could it be that the tidal volume increases disproportionately to cause an increase of minute volume? So paradoxically, you're breathing less breaths, but you now are breathing more air than what you were breathing before you started. And as I said, you blow off too much carbon dioxide, you've got reduced blood flow going to the brain, you've got reduced oxygen delivery to the brain, you've also increased blood pH, which is increasing brain cell excitability. So if we're doing slow breathing to help with calm and to help with stress and to help with mental health, we have to be careful. It's not just about slow breathing. It's never about slow breathing. It's never just about counting the breath. It's never just by breathing in for 5 and out for 5, in for 4, out for 6, in for 3, out for 5, in for 2, out for 7, whatever cadence people use. Never just about the respiratory rate. You have to consider tidal volume. You have to consider minute volume. So when you're doing slow breathing, think about how much air you're breathing with each breath. Hello, Patrick McKeown here. Thanks so much for supporting our Buteyko Clinic channel. Can I ask you a big favor? Would you mind subscribing? And with this, we can support the channel more, we can put out more videos, and it would really mean a lot. Buteyko, for me, has been life-changing and life-changing for the people that we're working with, and we would love to see it getting out there. So please subscribe. Thanks very much.